This is an intro video lecture into reviewing the geography and the early peoples of Rome, or really the people who rule over it, the Etruscans. So on our first slide we have an image of the Colosseum, probably one of the most famous buildings to represent the idea of Rome. There are two videos embedded in this PowerPoint. I'm not going to play them. They are linked in the description below, and you got to make sure that you go back and you watch those as you finish your notes. So let's get started. So there's a video. The link will be posted below. To review the geography, so Italy is obviously in a peninsula in the Mediterranean, kind of sits in the middle of the Mediterranean, and Rome itself is in the center of Italy, about halfway down the peninsula. There are two mountain ranges you do need to know: the Alps in northern Italy that separate Italy, Switzerland, and France, and then the Apennines go down the spine of Italy, down the center of the peninsula. Okay, and the two islands, the most important one to know is Sicily, because that's going to play an important role in the Rome-Carthaginian wars we call the Punic Wars. Okay, so in your notes, please make sure that you know it's centrally located, not just the city of Rome in the Italian peninsula, but also in the Mediterranean. They are a predominantly agrarian culture, despite the fact that their economy is going to rely on sea trade. Italy is rather mountainous, but it's not to the same extent as the Greeks, where the Greeks will rely more heavily on sea trade. It's kind of their lifeline. Italy and the Romans have a little bit more of a compatible relationship. They do farm, but they also rely on sea trade as well. The Alps and the Mediterranean will act as kind of a buffer zone or offer protection from invaders, which allows them to develop their society in relatively, not a lot of early fighting until their society is established. There are going to be four groups in Italy around the time when Rome is founded. The first one is the Etruscans. They're in the northern part of Italy, a place that we're now we call Tuscany. The Phoenicians are on mainly the coastal areas around the islands. Remember, my Phoenicians were early sea traders and farers, so they're going to develop into the Carthaginians that you see in purple. The Greeks, they're also going to establish colonies, mainly because of the fact that they can't farm and they need to find other places to where the land will sustain farming. So they're going to be mostly in southern Italy, around the toe and the heel. And finally, the Latins settle along the Tiber River in the center of Italy, and once the city of Rome is founded, they're going to become the Romans. Alright, so there's really two myths and then reality when it comes to the founding of Rome. The two myths are the story of Romulus and Remus, and the second one is the epic poem of the Aeneid, written by Virgil. In reality, the most important thing is that the Latins live along the Tiber River. They're ruled by the Etruscans for a couple hundred years. And finally, they're going to kill the last Etruscan king in 509 BCE and establish the Roman Republic. And from that point on, we call them the Romans. Alright, so let's look at these a little bit more. The legendary date for the founding of Rome is a date that you do need to know, and that is in 753 BCE. There were these two brothers who were princes, and they were kind of stolen and then thrown down a river, left to die, essentially. Romulus and Remus. A she-wolf or lupine finds them and raises them, lets them live, and those two boys end up building a city where they were raised, right along the Tiber River. Romulus and Remus, as they grow older, are going to fight for power. There's kind of a contest to see which one should rule. Romulus fights Remus, Romulus eventually killing his brother, and the city of Rome is named after Romulus. So here we have a video. It's again in the description for the video. The link is in the description. You want to make sure that you pause it and you watch it. The second legend is the story of Aeneas, and that's in the epic poem the Aeneid, modeled after the Iliad and the Odyssey of Greece. And it actually connects all the way back to the story of Troy. But this wasn't a legend that's as old as Romulus and Remus. When we have our first emperor, Augustus, he actually commissions Virgil, the most famous playwright of his day, to write an epic about the founding of Rome. And he comes up with a fantastic tale of Aeneas being a Trojan boy, flees Troy as it burns, and he leads a party of refugees essentially, and he faces many trials and tribulations and fighting monsters and people trying to kill him and storms, and eventually they make their way to Italy. And we see a lot of parallels to the Iliad and the Odyssey, kind of connecting Roman history with Greek history, because the Romans are going to rule over the Greeks for quite some time. And they adopt a lot of their same cultural practices, like their religion. The Etruscans, however, is the real story of how the Romans got established. And the Etruscans ruled over Rome for a couple hundred years. The Etruscans also share some beliefs and practices with the Greeks. They are a polytheistic religion. And in their religion, to move on to the afterlife, you need to bring all the things with you into the afterlife. And so their tombs resemble their homes. They are very innovative in metalworking. You can see a bronze statue of a guy called the Orator. Very difficult to produce in one solid piece of bronze. That took a lot of skill in art and architecture, particularly of the arch, and also engineering. The Etruscans kind of remind me of the Minoans in the sense that their culture has a lot of life. There's happiness to it. They've got a lot of pastels in their art. Like you see here, there's a guy standing in profile with playing a double kind of flute, essentially. And the way that we know most about the Etruscans is through their tombs. And so let's look at that. But first, thing about their architecture. Here we have an Etruscan temple. As you can see, you've got columns, and these are of the Doric style. But it's a little bit different. Notice the columns, unlike the Greek temples, don't go all the way around the temple like the Parthenon does. There's just columns up at the front where you would enter. Also, there's statues across the roof, not statues inside that triangular pediment like the Parthenon has. So we see some similarities, but also some differences in the architecture that they had. So going back to what I was saying earlier, most of what we know about the Etruscans comes from their tombs. And the most famous site is at Chivetri in Italy. It's right outside Rome, about maybe an hour. And the Etruscans believed that you cannot or you should not bury your dead where living people live. So they actually built kind of a model of their city outside of the living city walls, and we call that a necropolis, or a city of the dead, because it's got roads and pathways and little teeny tiny houses in these mounds, and each mound was for a certain family. So the bigger your mound, the more important your family was. And this is how we know most about the Etruscans. So when you go in there, and you can take a tour, each mound was for a family group, and the mounds were originally, they were brightly painted and covered with artifacts of belongings of the family. They have stone beds where they would lay the bodies out. They would wrap them up. of the dead, and they would place them on these stone beds for eternity. And then when it came to sealing the tomb, as part of their practices, they would light a fire and then have a procession where all the living people leave the tomb and leave the fire burning inside the tomb. And if you know a little bit about science, fire needs oxygen to continue to burn. So eventually that fire, when they shut the door, will burn up all the oxygen or take up all the oxygen in the room, like essentially sealing it and making it airtight, and preserving the bodies inside from decay as part of their practice. Now, when another family member died, they would open up the tomb and do the process all over again. But these tombs, and here we have an image, would be highly decorated, full of objects, everyday objects that you need, kind of like the Egyptian pharaohs. You have, over on the left-hand column, you have some rope, and you can see an axe and a sword, and there's also decorative, almost kind of like a cat curling up with leaning down on their front paws. There's also cooking utensils buried in here, so a lot of what we know about the Etruscans comes from their tombs. However, the Romans are unhappy being ruled by the Etruscans, and particularly of the last Etruscan king. His name was Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. The last Etruscan king, and the Romans organize a rebellion, and they overthrow him and they kill him because he was a terrible tyrant, and they establish the Roman Republic, or representative democracy. And that happens in 509 BCE. That is a date that you do need to know. So 753, the city is founded. 509, they overthrow the Etruscan rulers and establish a republic. Finally, the Republican era is going to last about 500 years. And it's a time of Roman expansion and conquest, with nearly continuous warfare. The Roman culture and civilization spread from the Hellenistic East, that's where Persia was, and the conquest of Alexander the Great's empire, to northern Africa, into Spain, but all the way across northern Africa to all the way to Morocco, up into Spain and into Gaul, that's France, and even to the British Isles. And that lasts for up to 482 years, until a guy named Julius Caesar is going to become a little too powerful, and he declares himself dictator, and then we're going to have an empire. But that's a different time. So you want to make sure that you have your notes completed so far. Don't forget to go back and to look at those 2 other videos linked in the description below.